Hey, welcome back. Now, thus far in this section, we have an animated Scarfy sprite just running in front of a white background, which is quite boring. So we'd like to explore how we can draw a background that scrolls past to make it look like Scarfy's running. So in this video, we're going to talk about how we can accomplish having a scrolling background behind Scarfy so the game looks a bit more dynamic. Now here's our Raylib window, and we know how to load and draw different textures to the screen. One of the textures in our textures folder is this background image. Now, some of it may cut off due to the dimensions of our window, but that's not a big deal. Now we can draw this to the screen and give it a position. With an X and Y position of 0 and 0, the upper left corner of the texture will be at the upper left corner of our canvas as shown here. Now, if we change that X and scroll it to the left, then our image will continue to scroll, but we'll have some empty space here. So we're just going to end up seeing white as we scroll the image to the left. For this reason, we can draw two images. So we'll have a duplicate here, so we're constantly drawing two images at any given point in time. Now, Raylib has a function called drawTextureX, and the X stands for extra parameters. DrawTextureX takes a texture 2D just like drawTextureRec, only drawTextureX also takes a vector 2 for the position, as well as a float for a rotation and another float for the scale. So we can rotate the image and scale it up or down. And of course it takes a color in case we want to tint it. So let's set up our project so we can draw a background image. Let's go all the way back up outside the while loop, and just under our velocity variable, we can create a new texture 2D for the background image. So let's make a texture 2D and call this background. And we can initialize it using the load texture function, just like we did with Scarfy and the nebula textures. Remember, load texture takes a file path in double quotes. Now here is the textures folder in our project. And the background I'd like to draw is this image here called far-buildings.png. So let's go ahead and load this texture. So in load texture, we're going to pass in textures slash far-buildings.png. Now we have a texture 2D variable called background, and we can use this to draw our texture. Now let's scroll down to the while loop, and I'd like to draw the background just after we clear the background with our clear background function call. So let's add a comment and say draw the background. And we're going to call draw texture X. Now draw texture X takes a texture 2D for the texture. We're going to pass in background. Next we need a vector 2, which is a position, so we need to create a vector 2 variable, and I'm going to call this bg pause, and I'm going to initialize it for now with the values of 0, 0.0, 0.0. And let's pass in bg pause for that vector 2. Next we have a float for the rotation. I'm going to pass in 0.0 since I don't want to rotate this texture. Now for the scale, let's see what happens when we pass in 1.0, and for the color, I'm going to pass in white. Now before we test this out, I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom where we're unloading our textures, and I'm going to call unload texture with our background. So unload texture, passing in background. Now we can go ahead and hit run and start debugging to see what this looks like. And here we have it. We're drawing the texture at position 0, 0. Now the texture is quite small, so we're going to want to actually bump up the scale on this. Let's bump the scale up to 2 so that we can cover the entire window with this texture. So I'm scrolling all the way up to where we're calling draw texture X, and for the scale, instead of 1.0, I'm going to pass in 2. Now when I hit run and start debugging, our background is large enough to cover the entire screen. Okay, great. Now let's scroll this background across the screen. I'm going to come up out of the while loop and create an x-coordinate variable. Now this is going to be a float since we're using a vector 2 and the members of a vector 2 are floats. I'm going to call this bgx BG standing for background. And I'm going to use braced initialization to initialize it to a value of 0. And now in our while loop, just after clear background, I'm going to update the background x position. So I'm going to say BGX, and I'd like to scroll by 20 pixels per second, so I'm going to multiply by 20 times dt. This way our movement is frame rate independent. Now we're using BG pause in draw texture x. So instead of 0 for the x, we're going to now use BGX, which gets updated every frame. Let's go ahead and hit run and start debugging and see how this looks. Here's our background, and we can see it scrolling to the left by 20 pixels per second. Now, we see this empty space here because we're only drawing the texture once, and we discussed earlier that we're going to need to draw this texture twice. So in summary, we use the function drawTextureX to draw the texture to the screen using some extra parameters. We scaled up the background by 2, and we scrolled the background at 20 pixels per second, and we saw that we get some empty space because we still need to draw the texture twice. We'll handle that in the next video. I'll see you soon.